You're watching BBC Newsroom Live. It's 11 a.m. These are the main stories this morning. The inquiry into breast surgeon Ian Paterson, who carried out hundreds of unnecessary operations, will be published in an hour. Victims and their families arrive to hear the results. Good morning, welcome to BBC Newsroom Live. I'm Joanna Gosling. Victims of rogue breast surgeon Ian Paterson have been gathering in Birmingham ahead of the publication of an independent report into his practices. He worked at NHS and private hospitals in the Midlands and exaggerated or invented cancer risks. He left many patients disfigured. He was jailed for 20 years in 2017. John Maguire reports.
When Ian Paterson was jailed in 2017 for carrying out hundreds of cases of unnecessary breast surgery, the trial judge said he had deliberately preyed on his patients' worst fears. Working at both NHS and private hospitals in the West Midlands, he treated thousands of patients. In many cases, he would encourage people to undergo surgery more than once, knowing that what he was doing was totally unwarranted.
That's something that will never ever go away. It's not just the physical scars that won't go away, it's the mental scars as well. They will never go.
I think some of the times people will look and think, oh well, it's done now, but it isn't for us. The psychological implications is never ending.
For the many hundreds, if not thousands, affected by Paterson's malpractice, today's report will be expected to shine a light not just on what he did, both in the NHS and private sector, but also on how the system could allow him to get away with it on such a scale and for so long. John Maguire, BBC News.
Well, Linda Miliband is the National Practice Lead for Clinical Negligence at Thompson Solicitors. She has supported a number of Paterson's victims with legal claims. Overall, the company helped 650 patients. Thank you for joining us. Well, as we await the findings of the report, what are your hopes on what it might say?
Well, obviously it's very important because so many patients did suffer so much and those scars are still with them today. So I would really like them to get some justice from this. The most important features for me as a lawyer are to ensure that all private hospitals have adequate insurance to cover for every operation that happens within their operating theatres, and also that the regulatory systems to spot breast and any other rogue surgeons operating within the private sector are much better.
And so on that issue of insurance, without insurance, victims won't presumably get compensation because it's then the liability of the individual who won't have the funds to cover it. What are the concerns around insurance? Do hospitals not have that insurance as much as you would like?
Well, the argument is that all surgeons are private operators, so they have to have their own insurance. But in Paterson's case, he only had £10 million, which was never going to be enough to pay the number of people who were injured. And because he was acting as a private operator, Spire's own insurance was not supposed to cover that. And that was really why there was the enormous argument there was prior to settling the case in 2017. So realistically, what would be good for everyone is if it could be ensured that all insurance was covering everything that was done within the private hospital.
I mean, obviously what you're talking about there are wider changes to try to protect patients going forward. For the patients that you've represented, where are they now? Are there next steps for them?
Well, I mean, I think from today they're going to want some sort of system to improve the regulatory practices and also the insurance systems. And I think that they would like those to be brought in as swiftly as possible.
We're talking in monetary terms, as always in these situations when it comes to compensation for trying to right a wrong. How are those who you represent coping with what they've been through?
Well, obviously, I think today will be a big day because it will bring back all the problems that have they've put up with for so many years very bravely, because they've had to go through the criminal trial, then there was the settlement, and obviously now there's the investigation. And I think each one of these events will bring back very unpleasant memories. So I would imagine that they're all pretty devastated at this moment.
Thank you very much for joining us, Linda Miliband from Thompson Solicitors, and we should have the details of the inquiry findings from midday. An update on our headlines on BBC News. You're watching BBC Newsroom Live. It's midday. These are the main stories. A report into how breast surgeon Ian Paterson was able to carry out hundreds of unnecessary operations at hospitals in the West Midlands has said patients were let down by a health system that was dysfunctional at every level. This is The Scene live in Birmingham, where a news conference on the inquiry is about to begin, and we'll bring it to you as soon as it begins. And we are now going back to the Paterson inquiry. This is the inquiry chair, the Right Reverend Graham Jones, the former Bishop of Norwich.
Important that the patients heard first about the content of the report. This has been a patient-led inquiry, and there would have been no inquiry at all if it were not for the pressure of patients to have one. The number of patients and their relatives who gave evidence to the inquiry exceeded our expectations. What we heard from them was harrowing, and I commend their courage and dignity in giving us accounts of experiences they would rather forget, except that they cannot forget. Patients and their families live daily with the consequences of unnecessary treatment from Ian Paterson. While you will all have copies of the report, what I want to do, as I've already done with the patients at even greater length, is to present the wider story of this inquiry. I will highlight some of the statistics, but more importantly, tell the narrative and what we have learned. 211 patients and relatives gave us detailed accounts of the treatment of 177 patients. 80 patients were from the NHS, 92 from the private sector, and 5 were NHS patients treated in a private hospital and funded by the NHS. Many had never spoken before, beyond friends and families, about being a Paterson patient. And what they told us provided the basis for our questions to the corporate witnesses, to the individuals, the organisations and institutions that we saw, 115 corporate witnesses, many of whom should have kept patients safe but failed to do so. And each evidence session provided a piece of a large jigsaw. Gradually, as we put those pieces together, a bigger picture emerged. And in that picture, the malpractice of Ian Paterson is plain to see, and frequently described in very painful detail. The overwhelming majority of patients were distressed to discover, usually at recall appointments, that they should not have had any surgery at all, or that they had the wrong procedure. And many of them were lied to, deceived, and exploited. They lived with the devastating consequences of Ian Paterson's malpractice. and no inquiry is going to change that. But they have been determined that the wider story should be told, and that if possible something like this should never happen again to other patients. The inquiry report contains at its heart 87 pages of patient accounts. The suffering described, the callousness, the wickedness, the failures on the part of individuals and institutions, as well as Paterson himself. These are vividly described in what patients told us. The scale of what happened, the length of time this malpractice went on, the terrible legacy for so many families. It's difficult to exaggerate the damage done, including to trust in medical organisations and clinicians. I was asked several times at the beginning why the inquiry was established and why there was a need for a whole inquiry about a single rogue surgeon. Was it not disproportionate? But it isn't simply about a single individual, of course, although the sheer number of patients Ian Paterson treated between 1998 and 2011 illustrates on its own just how many people are involved. In that period, Paterson treated 6,617 patients at Spire. 4,077 had a surgical procedure or operation, of whom 2,399 had some form of breast surgery. These are very large numbers, and the figures show how many operations or procedures undertaken were not breast surgery, and this is reflected in the patient accounts. In the NHS, at the Heart of England Foundation Trust, as it then was, Paterson had 4,424 breast patients in the same period. So this would be tragic enough if it was simply about a rogue surgeon, but it's much more than that. It's the story of a healthcare system which proved itself dysfunctional at almost every level when it came to keeping patients safe, and where those who were the victims of Paterson's malpractice were let down time and time again. They were let down not just by a consultant who regularly performed unnecessary or inappropriate operations, but by an NHS trust and an independent health provider who failed to supervise him properly and did not respond adequately to concerns about his practice. Opportunities to stop him were missed time after time. And once action was finally taken, patients were let down again by wholly inadequate recall procedures in both the NHS and the private sector. Patients were unsupported when they learned that they had been the victims of serious malpractice. Some complained to regulators and were mostly treated with disdain. They were let down further when it became clear that Paterson's malpractice was criminal and his discretionary medical indemnity for his private practice was withdrawn. So could something like this happen again? What could be done to prevent that? We were told repeatedly by regulators and other witnesses that procedures had improved in recent years and the system was more vigilant, with appraisal and revalidation taken much more seriously. And this is true. But in Paterson's years of practice, there were many regulations and guidelines in place which were disregarded or ignored, and not simply by him. It was striking that while managers and regulators were confident another Paterson would be identified, the clinicians we consulted were not convinced. They thought it was a culture of avoidance and denial that was the problem, and wherever such a bad culture is found, patients may not be safe. Well, my report sets out what can only be described as willful blindness in relation to Paterson's behaviour and aberrant clinical practice. Colleagues avoided or worked around him. Some could have known, others should have known, and a few must have known. At the very least, a great deal more curiosity was needed and a broader sense of responsibility for patient safety in the wider healthcare system by clinicians and managers alike. There was too much keeping heads down. Some may have been inhibited from complaining because they'd seen colleagues raise concerns about Paterson and getting nowhere. Some of his more junior colleagues commented that the unusual character of his surgical practice, compared with other breast surgeons, was well known. To a surprising degree, he was hiding in plain sight. Now, victims have rightly been our focus, but the impact of what happened has been enormous for many clinicians and others who either worked for Paterson or encountered him. Those who did raise concerns but were then poorly served by those to whom they reported have themselves been traumatised. Some who should have acted now live with the guilt of not doing so. Others are in a state of denial. Among patients and their families, there are many who believe that those who worked closely with Paterson should answer for their actions and negligence. Now, this has been an independent inquiry and not a tribunal or a court. However, I did promise the patients that if during our work we found healthcare professionals or others whom we believe should be investigated by their disciplinary bodies or the police, I would report them to the relevant authorities. The work of subsequent investigation lies outside our terms of reference, but I have confidence it is being pursued. I have reported 5 healthcare professionals to either the General Medical Council or the Nursing and Midwifery Council. In addition, I have referred one matter for investigation by the West Midlands Police, since it seems to me to go beyond professional misconduct alone. So what else is to be done? Well, there is no single action which will prevent malpractice or deception on its own, whether among clinicians or any other professionals. But it should be detected quickly, and our recommendations, taken as a whole, are intended to enable that. 8 years passed between medical professionals first raising concerns about Paterson's practice and his suspension. And in that time, there were a series of reviews of what he did, and he was given the benefit of the doubt time and time again, undeservedly. And the consequences for patients have been terrible. I have made 15 recommendations to empower and protect patients. Even now, there are Paterson patients who have not been recalled, and those treated in the private sector have not been given an ongoing care plan. We believe the recall of patients must be completed and this failure remedied. There's not a single change to regulations or procedures which would prevent another Paterson, but swift action to suspend a doctor or other healthcare professional when the concerns and complaints are as serious as they were in Paterson's case is essential. It is bewildering that he continued to practice for so long. A single repository of information about consultants' practicing privileges and performance should be available to both managers in the health service and to the public. Many patients were told that Ian Paterson was the go-to surgeon in this area, but they had no means of verifying that. Many patients were wrongly told that their life was in danger and agreed to an operation in a single, sometimes brief consultation. We believe a pause is needed before patients agree to treatment, and the senior clinicians on our panel agreed. Patients treated in the private sector were left without cover and had to fight to be compensated. Arrangements for clinical indemnity should be reformed as a matter of urgency and a safety net introduced so that patients are not disadvantaged when things go wrong. The regulatory system did not keep patients safe when Paterson was practicing. This needs to change to serve patient safety as its top priority. The range of recommendations is such that, if implemented, they would serve to change the culture. It is not the case that there's a lack of regulation or guidance. There's plenty of it. But it must be adhered to, and if the private healthcare sector does not implement recommendations which become part of NHS practice, we believe that NHS-funded treatment in private hospitals should no longer be allowed. Patients should not be less safe in one part of the healthcare system than they are in another. And I realise this has been a lengthy presentation at the beginning of a press conference, But there's much to say about what happened to patients over many years, and they have shown enormous dignity and courage in speaking to us, and I pay tribute to them. Thank you all very much indeed. Okay. Do you want to?
Yeah.
Chair?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Hugh Pym, BBC News. You posed the question in your presentation, could this happen now? And you
Journalists are now just asking questions of the inquiry chair, the Right Reverend Graham James, who has announced the findings of an independent review into rogue surgeon Ian Paterson. We'll stay with coverage of this on the BBC News channel. Say goodbye to viewers on BBC Two.
That we're going to abolish wickedness and people lying and deceiving others in any professional position isn't likely. What I think is necessary is for that to be detected very quickly, and 8 years is not quick detection. It is possible. I mean, the clinicians that we met say that where there's a culture of avoidance and denial, this is possible, because regulations and guidance are only effective if they are adhered to. If they are ignored, and if somebody is lying and manipulating in whatever sphere, then of course consequences are going to be bad. That's why we're concentrating on both empowering and protecting patients and making certain that there is a level playing field of patient safety between the private sector and the NHS.
And you say you'd like to see the NHS bringing procedures back in-house from the private sector if certain things are done. Can you just say in simple terms what the private sector still needs to do now to get up to a standard you think is appropriate?
What we say is that if the recommendations we make are accepted in the NHS, they ought also to be accepted in the private sector. Now, the government cannot simply impose that on them. The private sector has got to accept that. But our view is that NHS-funded treatment in the private sector is very significant to the private sector. But those patients who are NHS-funded in the private sector should not be less safe. So we believe that where our recommendations in relation to patient safety are accepted in the NHS, they should equally be accepted in the private sector.
First of all, sir, can you tell us anything more about the case
Can
that
you identify who you are?
Oh, sorry, apologies. Michele Paduano, BBC Midlands Today. First of all, can I ask, can you give us any more information about the case that you've referred to the West Midlands Police, because it was so heinous?
No, what I cannot do is name those individuals I have referred to. In the report, we name those who had a legal or a statutory authority for patients, for example, chief executives of trust, board members, those who are in charge of regulatory bodies. We don't name any healthcare professionals. And we believe that, I mean, one of the things we're not is a court or a tribunal. So I've done the reporting to those who should undertake the investigation, but I'm not releasing names.
Okay, I want to ask, we've had the Bristol inquiry, we've had the Stafford inquiry, we've had obviously this inquiry, and we're going to have problems in Shrewsbury with babies in the not too distant future. What faith do you have that this inquiry is going to make a difference, given that those others didn't?
Well, I've got faith that the government set up this inquiry. I think the recommendations that we've made are proportionate and achievable, and that they would in themselves change the culture, because our concentration is on empowering and protecting patients.
Andy Davis, Channel 4 News. Is it possible at this stage to come to a figure as to how many patients do you think received inappropriate or unnecessary treatment at the hands of Ian Paterson?
All I can do is give you, as I have done, the overall figure of those whom he treated. Of course, in many cases, they have not been recalled and individually investigated. So that figure isn't available with any degree of accuracy. All I can say is that hundreds of patients, many hundreds, have been compensated, but they are not the full figure by any manner of means, because we've seen patients who have not been recalled and have not been compensated. But we think that recall should now be completed, certainly in the private sector, but also there are some who've never been recalled in the NHS.
So is it your suspicion that that number could exceed 1,000 patients?
I think almost certainly that's the case. Indeed, I think we know that's the case in terms of the compensation figures.
Alison Stacey, Birmingham Mail. You say in the inquiry that Paterson provided a written statement to the inquiry. Are you able to give us a summary of his own views on or explanation of his own crimes?
I can't give you a summary, I think, very quickly of a very lengthy statement. But what we did do was complete a process whereby all those who were criticised in the inquiry, including Ian Paterson himself, received a list of those criticisms we were making so that they could answer them in advance and we could take them into account. That's what we did for everybody. And we did give Ian Paterson an opportunity, if he wished, to meet me and other members of the inquiry team, and he declined to do so.
Hello, sir. Sean Linton from The Independent. Can I just ask you, you touch on in your recommendations around the, I think what you described as a gap in the liability and corporate responsibility in relation to practicing privileges. But the report doesn't seem to make any firm proposals on that, just to say that the government should act on that, which seems a bit too vague to me. I just wondered if I could ask you to say perhaps what you think should happen in relation to practicing privileges, and perhaps explain why you didn't set out any specific request on that.
But we do say, of course, I mean, there are two things about this. Well, the first is that we are suggesting a single source of information about consultants' practicing privileges and clinical performance that would be available to managers in the private sector as well as to the NHS, so that judgments about the giving of practicing privileges can be informed. And we also believe that that repository of information, that single source of information about consultants, should be made available to the public, so that patients themselves can have some source of information about the effectiveness of a consultant, how frequently they've performed an operation, what their record is, because that isn't available to the public in an accessible way at the moment. The connection between responsibility and liability we speak about is when things go wrong in private healthcare. We believe that private healthcare providers should be both responsible and liable for their patients, so that if something goes wrong, they should be appropriately compensated, and they should take responsibility for what happens in their hospitals. What we've not done is provide some preferred legal mechanism for achieving that, because there are various ways in which that could be done. And what we don't want to happen, we want the government to accept that responsibility, which we think is urgent to establish, so that patients are properly protected in private healthcare. But we're content for the government to work out a way to do that themselves. And I know from some previous inquiries the specificity of a recommendation can prevent it being implemented because there may be weaknesses in what has been presented. So we want the principle to be established. How it is then introduced is one for the government to determine.
Martin Fricker from the Daily Mirror. Just talking about this single repository, are you talking about a website where I could go on and see if this consultant's had a complaint, like a review?
That would be an obvious way of doing it, yes. Yeah. I mean, there's no reason why this information should not be public, in our view.
And the other question is about the criminal referral to West Midlands Police. Is that one individual? Is it a company?
It's over a matter that relates to someone, but it could, of course, involve other individuals as well. I mean, I've deliberately said it's a matter rather than an individual. It's related to potentially criminal practice. Yes.
Stephen writes in the Daily Mail. Apologies if this is in your report, I haven't been able to read it all, but did you approach Mark Goldman and Ian Cunningham to give evidence to the inquiry?
You will read, yes, you will read in there the evidence that a number of people gave, some of whom are named, and Mark Goldman is one of them because he was a chief executive of the trust. And Ian Cunliffe, do we name? Yes, we do, don't we? Yes, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, just want to be careful. Ian Cunliffe is named. Yeah.
In essence, your report seems to be suggesting there's been some sort of cover-up. Is that due to that in your own words?
Cover-up. I mean, what there has certainly been is a process over those 8 years, given there have been a number of reviews and reports that took place on Paterson's practice. He was given the benefit of the doubt again and again and again, and that had terrible consequences for patients. And what I think should happen is that where there's a danger to patient safety, patients should be given the benefit of the doubt rather than the consultant surgeon.
Josh Giltrap, LBC. What do you make of any victims who say the recommendations perhaps don't go far enough and their subsequent call for a public inquiry?
Well, a public inquiry, of course, would not be able to do anything different from this, except that it might take longer. I mean, there will be many more lawyers involved. But, of course, when a public inquiry reports, it cannot implement its own recommendations. I've just come from the patient session where we've had a great range of questions and it's been explained to them, and their response, it seems to me, was positive to what we have attempted to achieve. I mean, there are two things. It's setting out the whole story. It's then creating a range of recommendations that will empower and protect patients appropriately. We believe our range of recommendations is one that altogether they can be implemented in such a way that it would begin to change the culture, because much of this is to do with culture rather than regulations or guidance not existing. There are just a few places where there is no guidance. For example, there is no national guidance on how you should recall patients, which seems surprising. But in most cases, it was the avoidance of regulation and guidance that created the problem in the first place.
A couple more questions again.
Rajiv Paul, ITV News Central. It's been a difficult time, as we know, for the victims and their families. What do you hope the victims will draw from this inquiry? What do you hope they will take away from this?
Well, I think my sense from this morning's session and from the many individual sessions we've had is that many of the victims felt unheard, and they also felt devalued by the fact that they had suffered from someone's malpractice, and after that they felt that wherever they looked they were let down again, and in many cases had to fight for compensation when that was withdrawn because what they suffered from in the malpractice was so bad. So I hope the victims will at least feel that their stories have been heard, both individually and corporately. And just the stories themselves, just the narrative itself is powerful. But I also hope and believe that the recommendations that we make will ensure not just that the victims are heard, but that other patients will be better protected, and they will not be less well protected in the private healthcare sector than they are in the NHS.
This is the inquiry chair of the review into the practices of the rogue surgeon Ian Paterson. It's the Right Reverend Graham James who has been saying in the publication of his report that patients were let down over many years by multiple individual and organisational failures. We'll go back to that in a moment, but first I just want to now back to that briefing that we were just hearing from the independent review of issues surrounding the practice of the rogue surgeon Ian Paterson. He was convicted of 20 counts of wounding patients in 2017 and was jailed for 20 years. More than 200 of his patients gave evidence to the inquiry into his practices. about unnecessary breast surgery and botched operations which left them prone to cancer returning. He'd practiced in the NHS and also at private hospitals in the West Midlands and was suspended in 2011. Well, the inquiry chair, the Right Reverend Graham Jones, has said today patients were let down over many years by multiple individual and organisational failures. He said that patients have also been wholly let down by wholly inadequate recall procedures in both the NHS and the private sector, pointing out many of his patients have yet to be recalled. He said this is a story of a healthcare system which has proved itself dysfunctional at almost every level when it came to keeping patients safe. We'll have full reaction to that report coming up in the next half hour. Let's go back to our main news that an independent inquiry into how a breast surgeon was able to carry out hundreds of unnecessary operations has said patients were let down by a health system that was dysfunctional at every level. Ian Paterson worked in both NHS and private hospitals in the West Midlands and exaggerated or invented cancer risks, leaving many patients disfigured. The report says opportunities to stop him were missed on many occasions, and the government must urgently address gaps in responsibility between the NHS and the independent sector. Our health editor Hugh Pym is in Birmingham, and we can join him now for more reaction. Hugh, over to you.
Yes, I've just been at a briefing held by the chair of the inquiry, Bishop Graham James, former Bishop of Norwich, when he set out the summary of his findings, and he said in the report that this was the story of a rogue surgeon, which was tragic enough in itself, but it was a lot more than that. It was the failure of a healthcare system at all levels, letting down patients. Well, I'm joined now by two people who've been briefed today, and first of all, one lawyer for the patients. Just say what your position actually is, having heard this report.
I'm encouraged by the report, but what's important is that the recommendations are fully implemented. We want to make sure that everybody using the healthcare sector, whether that's NHS or private, are protected. Now, a recommendation has been made that there is an equal playing field between NHS patients and private patients, and it's for the government to decide how that's implemented. But it's really important that it is implemented. I'm also encouraged by the fact that 5 people have been reported to their regulatory bodies and 1 person to the police. So those management, I assume, that allowed this to happen are going to be held accountable, because only when they are held accountable will this thing and this problem stop, because otherwise it could occur again.
Does it go far enough, the report, do you think?
I'm happy that the recommendations have been made. Clearly we couldn't be told about the people who are involved. There are some issues in terms of proceeds of crime that haven't been addressed, so there are still some issues that need to be addressed, but it's a good starting point subject to the recommendations being implemented.
And it does say that even with all the regulators we've got now, 8 years on, more than after the suspension of Ian Paterson, the inquiry chair said that there still needed to be more coordination to stop this happening again.
There seemed to be a lack of information sharing, a lack of continuity between organisations, and people who were carrying out investigations were carrying them out in isolation when they didn't have all the full information. I mean, that cannot continue. And also the fact that there was a blind eye, willful blindness, I think the Reverend called it, that was turned by managers who just allowed the situation to occur. And it's an absolute tragedy for patients, and we are all going to be patients needing medical care at some stage, so it's in all of our interest that these recommendations are implemented.
Leslie, you're a former patient of Ian Paterson. How did you feel this morning, having been briefed on the report by the Bishop?
Yeah, well, obviously I'm very pleased about it, and as Kashmir said, the 15 points that have been brought up, as long as they're implemented, it is a step in the right direction.
Now, you went through a previous review and then the trial, hearing the evidence given there. Now you've been briefed on this report. How does it feel where we've got to now? Do you feel everything that could possibly have been learned from Ian Paterson and your experiences can be learned?
Well, I hope so. I hope so. That is the whole point of this report. So with best luck, everything will be implemented, things will be put in place, and especially in the private sector where the patient was not protected at all. So hopefully things will be put in place.
Do you think the NHS has learned lessons? Because I think you were referred through the NHS, weren't you?
Yes, I was referred through the NHS, but Mr. Paterson sort of more or less coerced us into going privately by telling me that my operations were urgently needed. And in actual fact, as I've found out many years later, I didn't have cancer at all.
And one point that comes across from the report is how both the NHS and the private hospital concerned didn't do much to recall patients or brief them on what had happened.
No, there was no briefing whatsoever. I eventually got a recall letter in 2014. My operations were in 2006. But I understand there are still patients who have not had that recall letter.
And so, in a sense, there's still more to follow through from this. We've heard of a report to West Midlands Police, I think to the coroner as well.
Yeah.
How do you see it developing from here?
Well, if the coroner finds that there were unnatural deaths and unlawful killing, then the inevitable step from that would be whether further charges need to be brought against Mr. Paterson in relation to those deaths.
And what about the ability of the whole system now to fully learn lessons, and how convinced are you that can happen?
Well, I'm not convinced at all at the moment, because we know that Spire have had to do a recall with another surgeon there, and so clearly the safety mechanisms that Spire have put into place since Paterson haven't worked, because another surgeon has been carrying out unnecessary operations, and apparently a third as well. So no, they haven't been effective, and no, they need to do more.
I think in that case the patient was the doctor was suspended very quickly and is still practicing in another part of the NHS.
But what I don't understand is, why was he not picked up earlier? If the multidisciplinary teams were working correctly, then they should have realised that operations that weren't needed were being carried out. And that was one of the failings with Paterson, the dysfunctional multidisciplinary team meetings and the total failure of management, inept management in controlling a man that was a bully and totally manipulative.
This report, though, is about the private sector as a whole, isn't it? And that there do need to be procedures in place in all private hospitals to come up to the standard of the NHS, and there's still learning needed from the NHS.
Absolutely. This is not just isolation to Spire, it's all private healthcare providers. At the moment, they're not liable for the actions of the doctors who work on their premises. They're given practicing privileges, and then they seem to wash their hands of any responsibility for them. That cannot carry on, because only when it affects them financially are they actually going to take any proper action.
Leslie, do you feel, having been through all what you went through and all these reviews, that I know you haven't had time to read the report yet, it's only just out, but I mean that there is a sense of at least something that you feel provides some form of reassurance that everything has been looked into?
It's reassuring that things are going forward, and hopefully things put in place, as I said before.
And was that the sense of the meeting of all the former patients and lawyers this morning?
Yes, it was, yes, yeah.
OK, well, thank you both very much indeed for talking to us, and we'll be covering this extensively throughout the day. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. Much more coverage of that coming up, as Hugh says.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. An independent inquiry has found that hundreds of patients treated by a rogue breast surgeon were let down over many years by numerous failures by individuals and organisations. Ian Paterson, who practised in the NHS and privately, was convicted of 20 counts of wounding patients in 2017 and jailed for 20 years. More than 200 patients gave evidence to the inquiry about unnecessary breast surgery and botched operations which left them prone to cancer returning. The inquiry chair said the healthcare system had proved itself dysfunctional at almost every level when it came to keeping patients safe. John Maguire reports.
These were the patients who became victims of Ian Paterson. When he was jailed in 2017 for carrying out hundreds of cases of unnecessary breast surgery, the trial judge said he had deliberately preyed on his patients' worst fears. Working at both private and NHS hospitals in the West Midlands, he treated thousands. In many cases, he would encourage people to undergo surgery more than once, knowing that what he was doing was totally unwarranted. Today, his victims are seeing the results of a major independent inquiry into his malpractice.
The inquiry report contains at its heart 87 pages of patient accounts. The suffering described, the callousness, the wickedness, the failures on the part of individuals and institutions as well as Paterson himself. Well, my report sets out what can only be described as willful blindness in relation to Paterson's behaviour and aberrant clinical practice. Colleagues avoided or worked around him. Some could have known, others should have known, and a few must have known.
With best luck, everything will be implemented, things will be put in place, especially in the private sector where the patient was not protected at all. So hopefully things will be put in place. Mr. Paterson sort of more or less coerced us into going privately by telling me that my operations were urgently needed. And in actual fact, as I've found out many years later, I didn't have cancer at all.
In some cases, the surgery dates back more than 20 years. Scars of the body and of the mind that are yet to heal.
I think some of the times people will look and think, oh well, it's done now, but it isn't for us. The psychological implications is never ending.
Yet still, after such an extensive inquiry, the key question of why remains unanswered. Paterson declined to give evidence at his trial. His victims' theories range from greed to playing God or just sinister self-belief. For the many hundreds, if not thousands, affected by his malpractice, today's report will be welcomed only if and when guarantees are in place that no one else will suffer as they did ever again. John Maguire, BBC News.
Well, let's talk to Catherine Stancheshin, who is at the inquiry. Just terrible what those women went through. What will now be done? What can be done to stop something like that happening again?
Well, today the Right Reverend Graham James, the chair of this independent inquiry, was asked whether or not something like this could happen again, and he said that whilst regulators say no, that is not the case, things have been tightened up since then, that some doctors still have concerns that patient safety just isn't at the forefront of some people's minds. 211 patients were interviewed for this independent inquiry, and it's heard heartbreaking testimony, as you've just seen, from women who were told they had breast cancer but didn't, and then faced mastectomies and in some cases several operations. At this press conference in the last hour, the chair of that independent inquiry has said Ian Paterson's patients were let down on multiple occasions, that actually the health system had been dysfunctional at every level. He said some could have known, others should have known, and a few must have known. 8 years passed between the initial reported concerns about Ian Paterson's conduct and his suspension, and today it was revealed that it's likely that the number of people who actually faced unnecessary breast operations here in the West Midlands was over 1,000. This report has made 15 recommendations, including a repository of data so that other people can see the performance of their surgeons, and also that all his patients are recalled. It also says the government must address as a priority the gap in responsibility between the public and private health sectors.
Catherine at the inquiry, thank you. I'm going to take you straight now to the House of Commons. The Health Minister Nadine Dorries is making a statement on the Paterson inquiry we were just hearing about.
Jail surgeons' malpractice that affected so many patients in the most appalling way. As the report states, between 1997 and 2011, Paterson saw 6,617 patients, of whom 4,077 underwent a surgical procedure in the independent sector, And between 1998 and 2011, Paterson saw 4,424 patients at the Heart of England Foundation Trust, of whom 1,207 underwent mastectomy. The report contains a shocking and sobering analysis of the circumstances surrounding Ian Paterson's malpractice. It sets out the failure in the NHS, the independent sector, and the regulatory and indemnity systems. As a result of these failures, patients suffered unnecessary harm. Their testimony in this report makes harrowing, appalling reading. As such, it is with deep regret that we acknowledge the failure of the entire healthcare system to protect patients from Ian Paterson's malpractice and to remedy the harms. Nothing I can say today, Madam Deputy Speaker, can lessen the horrendous suffering that patients and their families experienced and continue to go through. I can only start to imagine the sense of violation and betrayal of patients who put their trust in Ian Paterson when they were at their most vulnerable. That the inquiry reports today on World Cancer Day makes this all the more poignant. And I apologise on behalf of the government and the NHS for what happened, not least that Ian Paterson was able to practice unchecked for so long. I would also like to pay tribute to the bravery of all those former patients who came forward to tell their stories to the inquiry and whose anonymised accounts have been recorded in this report. I know this will make for difficult reading, as it highlights the human cost of our failure to detect and put a stop to Ian Paterson's malpractice. There was a catalogue of failings that resulted in harm to thousands of patients, causing devastation to countless lives. Some of these patients were let down several times, not least by the providers and the regulatory system that should have protected them, and by the failure of the medical indemnity system to provide any kind of redress at the first time of asking. From the outset, Bishop Graham wanted patients and their families to be central to the inquiry's work and to be heard. It was right, therefore, that patients and their families saw the report first, early this morning, shortly before it was presented to Parliament. Two aspects of the report are particularly striking to me: that the various regulatory bodies failed in their main tasks, and the absence of curiosity by those in positions of authority in the healthcare providers in the face of concerns voiced by other healthcare professionals. The report presents a tangled set of processes. Accountability was not exercised when it should have been. Some of the problems arose from not following through on established procedures, as opposed to insufficient procedures being in place. So, we must take full responsibility for what happened in the past if we are to provide reassurance to patients about their protection in the future. I am therefore very grateful that the suite of recommendations based on the patient journey present a route map for government. The recommendations are extremely sensible, and we will study them in detail. I can promise the House a full response in a few months' time. That response will need to consider the answer to some very important questions that cut right across the healthcare sector. Because, unequivocally, regardless of where patients are treated and regardless of how their care is funded, all patients should be confident the care they receive is safe, meets the highest standards, with appropriate protections, and that they are supported by clinicians to make informed decisions about the most appropriate course of care. I am also very aware that it is not the first time that the regulatory failure has been highlighted in an inquiry report. We have done much to make the NHS a safer system in recent years. Revalidation, a reformed CQC, and work by the Independent Healthcare Providers Network to establish the Medical Practitioners Assurance Framework to oversee medical practitioners in the independent acute sector. In the case of Ian Paterson, the system did not work for patients. Recent events at Spire show there are still serious problems to address. Patient safety is a continual process of vigilance and improvement. The inquiry does not jump to a demand for the NHS and the independent sector to invent multiple new processes, but to actually get the basics right, implement existing processes, and for all professional people to behave better and to take responsibility. NHSE and I published a new patient safety strategy last summer, led by the National Patient Safety Director, Dr. Aidan Fowler. It focused on better culture, systems and regulation. Very sensible yet familiar words. All things today's inquiry says were not delivered. What we need now is action across the NHS and its regulatory bodies, and the same determination to change in the independent sector. To conclude, we are absolutely committed to ensuring lessons are learned and acted upon from the findings of this shocking inquiry, in the interest of enhancing patient protection and safety, both in the NHS and the independent sector. For today, I apologise again on behalf of the Government and the NHS, and send my heartfelt sympathy to the patients and their family for the suffering they have endured.
Shadow Secretary of State, Jonathan Ashworth.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Lady for advance sight of her statement, and I welcome her apology on behalf of the Government and the National Health Service. And I indeed agree, the issues raised in this report are, as she says, shocking, serious, harrowing, and our thoughts are naturally with all the victims, innocent victims, of Ian Paterson. And as the Minister rightly acknowledged, today is indeed World Cancer Day. And we all know that a cancer diagnosis is frightening. And when we hand ourselves over, or hand a loved one over, to the care of a medical professional, we are literally trusting them with our lives. For that trust to be callously betrayed for financial gain, I believe is unforgivable and indeed, as it has been found, criminal. So can I associate myself with the remarks of the Honourable Lady in paying tribute to all the patients, all the victims, for their bravery in speaking out. Thanks to all who have represented them, including the various legal firms, including Thompson's, and thanks to Bishop Graham for putting together this report today. Now, the findings from the inquiry were published, I think, at 12 noon today, so the House will want time to fully digest and reflect upon the recommendations. But I think we all agree that while we cannot undo the awful harm that Paterson's criminal action has caused so many, lessons must be learnt and changes made so something so heinous doesn't happen again. This report must not remain on a shelf to be forgotten, because the report is clear. This wasn't just the action of one rogue lone surgeon, but systemic organisational failures were at fault as well. And fundamentally, it's time we address the question of safety in private healthcare providers and the way in which clinicians are able to operate in private providers with little oversight. Paterson worked under the so-called practising privileges model, effectively as a self-employed contractor where you'd get a fee on top of your NHS salary for each funded NHS operation carried out in the private sector. And moreover, private hospitals would often, and still often, incentivise referrals from consultants by giving them, for example, shares in those private hospitals. I believe this model creates financial incentives to distort clinical decision-making and can lead to over-treatment, as we have seen in the Paterson case, and indeed, as the Honourable Lady alluded to, earlier this month we've seen again something similar happening at Spire Healthcare, where they have been forced to recall hundreds of patients amid concerns over operations carried out by another surgeon. Now, the inquiry makes
the House of Commons now, where the Health Minister Nadine Dorries has just apologised on behalf of the NHS and the government for what happened to the very many patients of Ian Paterson, the breast surgeon who is now behind bars.
Hello everyone, this is Afternoon Live. I'm Simon McCoy. An independent inquiry has found that hundreds of patients treated by a rogue breast surgeon were let down over many years by numerous failures by individuals and organisations. Ian Paterson, who practised in the NHS and privately, was convicted of 20 counts of wounding patients in 2017 and jailed for 20 years. More than 200 patients gave evidence to the inquiry about unnecessary breast surgery and botched operations which left them prone to cancer returning. The inquiry chair said it was the healthcare system that had proved itself dysfunctional at almost every level when it came to keeping patients safe. John Maguire reports.
These were the patients who became victims of Ian Paterson. When he was jailed in 2017 for carrying out hundreds of cases of unnecessary breast surgery, the trial judge said he had deliberately preyed on his patients' worst fears. Working at both private and NHS hospitals in the West Midlands, he treated thousands. In many cases, he would encourage people to undergo surgery more than once, knowing that what he was doing was totally unwarranted. Today, his victims are seeing the results of a major independent inquiry into his malpractice.
The inquiry report contains at its heart 87 pages of patient accounts. The suffering described, the callousness, the wickedness, the failures on the part of individuals and institutions as well as Paterson himself. Well, my report sets out what can only be described as willful blindness in relation to Paterson's behaviour and aberrant clinical practice. Colleagues avoided or worked around him. Some could have known, others should have known, and a few must have known.
With best luck, everything will be implemented, things will be put in place, and especially in the private sector where the patient was not protected at all. So hopefully things will be put in place. Mr. Paterson sort of more or less coerced us into going privately by telling me that my operations were urgently needed. And in actual fact, as I've found out many years later, I didn't have cancer at all.
In some cases, the surgery dates back more than 20 years. Scars of the body and of the mind that are yet to heal.
I think some of the times people will look and think, oh well, it's done now, but it isn't for us. The psychological implications is never ending.
Yet still, after such an extensive inquiry, the key question of why remains unanswered. Paterson declined to give evidence at his trial. His victims' theories range from greed to playing God or just sinister self-belief. For the many hundreds, if not thousands, affected by his malpractice, today's report will be welcomed only if and when guarantees are in place that no one else will suffer as they did ever again. John Maguire, BBC News.
Well, let's go to Birmingham and speak to our correspondent there, Catherine Stan-Cheshan, and this report pulls no punches.
No, indeed. Ian Paterson is serving a prison sentence for his malpractice that led to this distress for so many people in the West Midlands after practising at the Little Aston and Spire Parkway private hospitals and in the NHS here as well. But as you heard there, 87 pages, 211 people gave heartbreaking testimony about how they were told they had cancer when they didn't have it. Some of those victims faced multiple surgeries, and there are still worries from relatives of loved ones that have died that maybe they could have been saved if they weren't waiting for treatment, essential treatment, after they'd been told they had to have an operation instead. Today, the Right Reverend Graham James said that Ian Paterson's patients were let down on multiple levels, that the health system had been dysfunction all the way through, and that actually some people must have known what was going on. It was 8 years between when the first reports of Ian Paterson's malpractice were given and his suspension. And the chair of this inquiry was asked whether or not he believed that this is something that could happen again. Now, he said that regulatory bodies say that that's not the case, but actually doctors that they interviewed for this independent inquiry said Potentially, because it's about a culture of avoidance, a bad culture around a powerful person, and if that is allowed to happen, then this is the kind of thing that goes wrong. The report has given 15 recommendations, including the recall of all patients by both Spire and the NHS. Now, many of them have been recalled already, but they say some of them, particularly in the private sector, haven't been giving an ongoing care plan, and that has to change. It also says that the government should address as a priority the gap between responsibility when it comes to the private sector and the NHS, that the communication there isn't good enough, and also that there should be a single repository or a database that details consultants practicing their privileges, what they are allowed to do, and also their key performance data that is intelligible to the public and something that is readily available. We know from this report also that 6 people have been referred. We haven't had any names, but the independent inquiry was given a remit to be able to refer on to other bodies if it felt necessary, and the chair said today that 5 healthcare professionals have been referred to industry bodies, professional bodies like the General Medical Council, and 1 individual has been referred to West Midlands Police. We've had a response from the government today, and Health Minister Nadine Dorries says, "I deeply regret the failures of the NHS and the independent sector to protect patients from the devastating impact of Paterson's malpractice. It's essential we all respond quickly and effectively to the lessons of this inquiry, and we will give thorough and detailed consideration to this report and provide a full response." It has been said many times today, though, by the chair and other people here, that it was very, very important that victims had their voices heard, and they have been.
Catherine, thank you very much. That's Catherine Stan-Chesham. We can speak now to Paula Gelsthorpe, who underwent 2 lumpectomies carried out by Mr Paterson in 2002 and 2009, and she's since found out both of those operations were unnecessary. I'll come to the experience in just a moment, but I just want to know what your reaction to these, well, stinging recommendations and criticisms are.
Yes, excellent. The one that stuck in...
I think we may have lost...
Interesting to be the 15 recommendations.
Sorry, Paula, we lost you on the line, so perhaps you can just start that again by just explaining your reaction.
Patient safety, a priority. I've said this all along. My case...
I'm really sorry. We're going to pull out of that because we'll try and re-establish that line with Paula Gelsthorpe, and we'll return to her a little later on. You're watching Afternoon Live from BBC News. Now, this is BBC News, our latest headlines. A healthcare system dysfunctional at every level. The damning report into breast surgeon Ian Paterson, who performed botched and unnecessary operations on hundreds of women.
On a daily basis, it affects us. I try not to let it rule my life, but to move forward, this was important to me. This was important for the people that have died to be heard.
And in the last few moments, we've had a reaction from the Chief Executive of Spire Healthcare. This is Jeremy Justin Ash. Following the publication of today's report, we once again apologise for the significant distress suffered by patients who were treated by Ian Paterson in our hospitals. We accept that there were a number of missed opportunities to challenge Ian Paterson's criminal behaviour when those incidents happened prior to his suspension in 2011. The statement goes on, we welcome the report and the voice it has given to patients. We fully support its recommendations and will work with government and the healthcare sector to ensure their implementation. And it says significant investment and progress has already been made in many of the areas highlighted today. I would reiterate that we have learned lessons from this incident and implemented change. A strong indicator of this is that 83% of our hospitals are now rated good or outstanding by the regulators, that's the Care Quality Commission, or their equivalents in Wales and Scotland. This includes Spire Parkway and Spire Little Aston, the 2 hospitals where Paterson practised, both of which were inspected at the end of 2019 and rated good. So that's a statement from Jeremy Justin Ash, Chief Executive of Spire Healthcare. You're watching Afternoon Live. Just a quick update on the case. This is of Ian Paterson, his malpractice, and the independent inquiry which has recommended the recall of his 11,000 patients for their surgery, much of it botched and unnecessary, to be assessed. We're just having a statement from the chair of the University Hospitals of Birmingham NHS Foundation Trust. This is the Right Honourable Jackie Smith, who says the Trust wholly condemns Paterson's practice while he was working at Heart of England NHS Foundation Trust. Poor management, culture and lack of governance at the time failed his NHS patients and other staff members who raised concerns and issues of safety that were not acted upon. She goes on, we therefore welcome today's report and its findings and fully support the recommendations that will reinforce transparent and publicly accountable practice and rigorous regulation to ensure the safest care and best possible outcomes for patients. It finishes, we acknowledge that many of Paterson's patients received appalling treatment whilst under the care of the NHS, and the UHB board will continue to do its utmost to ensure their ongoing support and care is the best we can offer in extremely distressing circumstances. That's Jackie Smith's statement, which has just come into us here at BBC News. Well, as well as operating on NHS patients, Paterson also worked at Spire, a private healthcare company. Their chief executive, Justin Ash, says the company didn't do enough to prevent the malpractice taking place.
We welcome the inquiry and we welcome the voice it's given to the victims. I've read the distressing testimony of Paterson's victims and we apologise. We apologise that Paterson could commit his crimes at Spire. We accept that when Paterson practised we didn't catch him quick enough. We should have caught him sooner. We have changed. Spire is changed. We've got much better regulation of consultants today, and the CQC has much stronger powers, and today over 80% of our sites are good and outstanding. We also fully support the recommendations of the inquiry, and we'll work closely with the government and everybody to make sure that they are implemented.
Well, let's go to Birmingham. We can speak to our health editor, Hugh Pym. And Hugh, I don't think in all my years I've seen such a damning report, certainly at the opening.
Well, that's right, Simon. It is a very comprehensive report. Of course, we heard a lot of evidence given against Ian Paterson during his trial when he was convicted in 2017. There'd been an earlier report on failings at the NHS Trust involved. But I think this independent review of the whole saga and any lessons learned shows for the first time the scale of it, that more than 11,000 patients were cared for by Ian Paterson, both in the NHS and at Spire, the private hospital. And the chair of the inquiry, Bishop Graham James, said more than 1,000 might have been affected in some way, harmed in some way, because of his care. They took evidence from 211 people. So the scale of it, but also whether lessons have been learned. And one of the messages from the inquiry chair was that even now, 8 years on, more than 8 years on from when he was suspended finally, that it's possible, according to doctors who gave evidence, that this sort of thing could happen again, that we have a lot of regulators, a budget of £500 million between them. But the Bishop's view is that actually he doesn't feel that patient safety is right at the heart of everything that they do. So he's come up with a series of recommendations for how things could be improved.
Currently more than enough regulators with sufficient budgets, but still not doing enough collectively. That's very strong.
Yes, I mean, his conclusion is this was a tragic story about a rogue surgeon, but much more than that, it was the failure of a whole healthcare system, the way the NHS and the private sector at the time, more than a decade ago, didn't talk to one another. Things have improved since then, he is quite clear, but still not quite with the integrated focus, sharing of information that is required. One of his recommendations is there should be a database centrally accessible for patients to look at the record and the performance data of different surgeons in different hospitals, a lot more transparency. And also that the minute some sort of investigation is begun into the conduct of a clinician, if it affects patient safety, they should be suspended immediately, pending the outcome of the investigation. With Paterson, there were suspicions back in 2003. The inquiry chair says He could have been stopped then. In 2007 there was definitely enough to stop him, but because regulators and hospitals weren't talking to each other, it didn't happen. It was finally in 2011 that he was suspended.
Hugh, thank you very much. That's Hugh Pym there in Birmingham.
Today at 5, the series of failings at many levels which allowed a breast surgeon to perform unnecessary operations on hundreds, possibly thousands of women. An official report says patients of Ian Paterson were let down by the failures of a dysfunctional healthcare system.
On a daily basis it affects us. I try not to let it rule my life, but to move forward, this was important to me. This was important for the people that have died to be heard.
We'll have details of the inquiry and the outcome, and we'll be talking to a woman who was 16 when Ian Paterson first operated on her. The other main stories on BBC News at 5. It's 5 o'clock. Our main story is the outcome of an independent inquiry which found that hundreds of patients, possibly thousands, treated by a breast surgeon in the West Midlands were let down over many years by numerous failures by individuals and organisations. Ian Paterson, who practiced in the NHS and privately, was convicted of 17 counts of wounding patients back in 2017 and jailed for 20 years. More than 200 patients gave evidence to the inquiry about unnecessary breast surgery and operations which left them vulnerable to a recurrence of cancer. The chairman of the inquiry said the healthcare system had proved itself to be dysfunctional at almost every level when it came to keeping patients safe. Our correspondent John Maguire has the latest.
These were the patients who became victims of Ian Paterson. When he was jailed in 2017 for carrying out hundreds of cases of unnecessary breast surgery, the trial judge said he had deliberately preyed on his patients' worst fears. Working at both private and NHS hospitals in the West Midlands, he treated thousands. In many cases, he would encourage people to undergo surgery more than once, knowing that what he was doing was totally unwarranted. Today, his victims are seeing the results of a major independent inquiry into his malpractice.
The inquiry report contains at its heart 87 pages of patient accounts. The suffering described, the callousness, the wickedness, the failures on the part of individuals and institutions as well as Paterson himself. Well, my report sets out what can only be described as willful blindness in relation to Paterson's behaviour and aberrant clinical practice. Colleagues avoided or worked around him. Some could have known, others should have known, and a few must have known.
With best luck, everything will be implemented, things will be put in place, and especially in the private sector where the patient was not protected at all, so hopefully things will be put in place. Mr Paterson sort of more or less coerced us into going privately by telling me that my operations were urgently needed, and in actual fact, as I've found out many years later, I didn't have cancer at all.
On a daily basis it affects us. I try not to let it rule my life, but to move forward, this was important to me. This was important for the people that have died to be heard, because without any exaggeration, there are so many unnecessary deaths.
In some cases, the surgery dates back more than 20 years. Scars of the body and of the mind that are yet to heal.
I think some of the times people will look and think, oh well, it's done now, but it isn't for us. The psychological implications is never ending.
Yet still, after such an extensive inquiry, the key question of why remains unanswered. Paterson declined to give evidence at his trial. His victims' theories range from greed to playing God or just sinister self-belief. For the many hundreds, if not thousands, affected by his malpractice, today's report will be welcomed only if and when guarantees are in place that no one else will suffer as they did ever again. John Maguire, BBC News.
Well, as we heard in that report there by John, the inquiry chair, the Bishop of Norwich, Graham James, described a toxic culture of avoidance and denial which helped to facilitate Ian Paterson's crimes. The Health Minister, Nadine Dorries, has apologised on behalf of the government.
It is with deep regret that we acknowledge the failure of the entire healthcare system to protect patients from Ian Paterson's malpractice and to remedy the harms. Nothing I can say today, Madam Deputy Speaker, can lessen the horrendous suffering that patients and their families experience and continue to go through. I can only start to imagine the sense of violation and betrayal of patients who put their trust in Ian Paterson when they were at their most vulnerable. That the inquiry reports today on World Cancer Day makes this all the more poignant. And I apologise on behalf of the government and the NHS for what happened, not least that Ian Paterson was able to practice unchecked for so long.
The Minister Nadine Dorries there in the House of Commons. Well, joining us now is Jade Edgington, who was a teenager when she began treatment with Ian Paterson. She had a lump removed from her breast on his advice when she was 16. She had another 3 lumps removed by him over the next 3 years, only to be told years later that the surgery had been unnecessary. She joins us now. Jade, very good of you to join us. Thank you so much. I'm just your thoughts today when you see the conclusions of this report and the very strong language about the failures at so many levels. What was going through your mind at that time when you saw these conclusions?
I think it's a really positive step because I think we've waited a long time for to have something come out that acknowledges that there was a lot of failures. I've said quite often along kind of the years that he was allowed to do these things. I think it's a really positive step forward, and I think the language is accurate. I think it was a horrendous time, and there's a lot of people that have been affected. So for me, it's a positive step forward, and I hope that the recommendations get taken seriously and implemented as quickly as possible.
In the past, you've made the point very powerfully about your age when you first had the treatment with the surgeon, and it's a question of trust, isn't it? Especially at such a young age. It's a question of trust for all of us with doctors, really, but at such a young age, when you don't question, so you're in a position of great vulnerability.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I've said it again, multiple times, like you just said there, we have no choice but to trust the people that are telling us these, these things. If I went into hospital tomorrow, if I took my daughter into hospital tomorrow, and somebody who's an expert tells you that this is what needs to happen, this is the course of treatment, you obviously have no choice but to go along with it. So I think that, again, like you said, puts you in a massive position of vulnerability. And being so young at the time, it's scary. But even now, we have no choice. So there does need to be some changes in the way that things are monitored, the procedures that are in place, and hopefully that will change off the back of this inquiry.
You give the strong impression there at the start of the interview that you're someone who wants to look positively at life, and you said, this is a positive step, the fact that this inquiry's come out. But could you share with viewers, the kind of impact that this has had on you? As I say, it started at the age of 16, but you didn't find out until some years later the truth of the situation. Is that right?
Yeah, it's really, really quite scary. I think when you're 16, like you say, you just trust in what people are telling you, but you don't have, you're not able to comprehend the seriousness of the situation you're in. And even some years later, in my early 20s, again, you can't comprehend the severity and how wide this kind of goes. That now I have my own daughter, I look and think, if someone did that to her, how would I feel? And then it makes me feel really sad for my parents at the time, and really angry, because how difficult it must be to kind of send your baby off to be put under anaesthetic, to be cut open, to have stitches, to then have to have your stitches removed, to have scars that are going to last the rest of my life. It does have an impact, and it's really scary that people have got away. Like you said, I try to think positively about it. I feel like I am one of the lucky people because I'm fit and I'm healthy. There are a lot of people who aren't here to speak. And that's why I want to communicate and want to do interviews like this, because more people need to hear about this, and you need to be more aware. And so hopefully now this inquiry's come out, there's been a lot of press coverage about it, people will be more careful and maybe ask for second opinions and maybe just do a bit more research before you just agree to have things done. But I think with the inquiry, a lot of changes and a lot of responsibility should be on the NHS, on the private sectors, to do more due diligence around what their surgeons are doing, because we are vulnerable. We don't have a choice. We have to trust the professionals.
That point leads me really to the final question, if I may, which is, you know, do you have more confidence that following a report like this, it'll be far more difficult for somebody like Paterson to operate in future, and, you know, to operate as he did for many years? Are you confident that the NHS, after an episode, a scandal of this kind, has learnt enough rules so that, you know, it won't happen again, or is much less likely?
Much less likely, I hope. I think that we're still a long way to go. The recommendations have come out. There's no kind of time frame around when these are going to be implemented, how they're going to be implemented, you know, what kind of what oversight is going to be in place following on from this. So I think we're a long way to go, but I do think that the media coverage on something like this is paramount, because people need to be more aware. At least if we educate people on the fact that this has happened, people, we don't want to fear, we don't want to be a fear-mongering or scaremongering thing, but I think people do need to be aware. So I think, you know, something like this coming out is going to be a positive step forward, but I do still think we've got a long way to go with it.
Jade, it's very good of you to talk to us, and thank you so much for sharing your experience. Good to talk to you.
Thanks.
Jade Edgington there for us, and our thanks to her. The time is 12 minutes past 5 now.
Tonight at 6, the culture of denial that enabled a rogue breast surgeon to get away with botched operations on hundreds of women. Ian Paterson is serving a 20-year jail sentence for his crimes. Now an inquiry says thousands of his other patients might be affected.
Colleagues avoided or worked around him. Some could have known, others should have known, and a few must have known.
Among his patients, women who didn't even have cancer, and others who were left with a much lower chance of survival.
If you were a Paterson patient, you were 50% more likely to get a reoccurrence of breast cancer because you'd been left with breast tissue, basically a time bomb, in your chest, ready to explode, ready to give you cancer because he didn't remove it.
What will it take to ensure this couldn't happen again? Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. A rogue surgeon in the Midlands was allowed to get away with hundreds, perhaps thousands of botched or unnecessary breast operations because a dysfunctional health system turned a blind eye to his crimes. An inquiry has found that opportunities to stop Ian Paterson were missed because of a culture of denial and avoidance among staff at NHS and private hospitals. As a result, 5 health professionals have been referred to their regulatory bodies. West Midlands Police are looking at another employee, and the inquiry is recommending that the cases of more than 11,000 other patients should now be reassessed. Sean Lloyd has more.
Their lives have been changed forever by Ian Paterson. Many of these women were told they had cancer when they didn't and underwent needless operations. Others were subjected to untested surgical techniques. They had campaigned for this independent inquiry, which has found they had been failed by the healthcare system at every level.
This was important to me. This was important for the people that have died to be heard, because without any exaggeration, there are so many unnecessary deaths. What people fail to realise is this guy's another shipman. And you start looking at the stats in this report, you'll understand why.
Ian Paterson had treated thousands of patients. Concerns had been raised about him in 2003, but he continued to practice both in the NHS and the independent sector until 2012. He'd moved between hospitals in the West Midlands without criticism being shared between the places where he'd worked. 2 years ago, he was found guilty in a criminal court, and his sentence for wounding later increased from 15 to 20 years. Today, the man who chaired this inquiry said opportunities to stop Paterson had been repeatedly missed.
My report sets out what can only be described as willful blindness in relation to Paterson's behaviour and aberrant clinical practice. Colleagues avoided or worked around him. Some could have known, others should have known, and a few must have known.
His report makes 15 recommendations, including automatic suspension if the person is investigated and patients are considered at risk, and that the information is passed on to their other places of work. Creating a database where patients can check a consultant's previous performance, and making patient safety a top priority across current regulation.
I think I just hated him from that minute, knowing that somebody in his position could be so devious and nasty.
Ian Paterson subjected Judy Conduit to 23 operations she didn't need. She can't understand how he got away with it.
If somebody had taken notice when they reported Mr. Paterson, so many people could have been spared what he put them through, but they just let him carry on.
In a highly regulated sector, it was said supervisors appeared to be waiting for someone else to act. The NHS Trust, where Paterson worked, said it supports the recommendations, and Spire Healthcare accepted that it had missed opportunities.
We should have caught him sooner. We have changed. Spire is changed. We've got much better regulation of consultants today.
The consequences of the crimes of this once respected surgeon continue to be felt by the patients he harmed. The findings of this report could be important for the future care of patients. Sian Lloyd, BBC News, Birmingham.
And our health editor Hugh Pym is in Birmingham for us. Hugh, the question most people are going to want to have the answer to is could this happen again?
Well, George, we certainly learnt more about the devastating scale of this scandal. More than 1,000 patients, it seems, affected in some way by the malpractice of the rogue surgeon. But the review says it was about a lot more than that as well. An utterly dysfunctional health system, NHS and private. Now, that was less than a decade ago, so what's happened since? Well, the inquiry chair, Bishop Graham James, says, yes, improvements have been made. But he says with all the regulators that are now there, with a budget collectively of £500 million a year, he's not totally convinced that they really have got patient safety at the heart of what they do. He says he took evidence from some clinicians who said, yes, this could happen once again. Now, I spoke to one regulatory source a short time ago who said, yes, the system was safer, but more work was needed. More work was needed to join up the work of different regulators, to share information, and to do more in terms of oversight to try to ensure that another rogue surgeon doesn't slip through the net again.
Hugh, thank you very much.
That's our health editor Hugh Pym. Well, we can speak now to Judith Ever, who was twice subjected to unnecessary operations by Ian Paterson. Thanks so much for joining us, Judith. You were first referred to him after finding a lump in one of your breasts back in June 2000. Tell us what happened.
Yes, well, I found a lump in my right breast and went to see my GP, who referred me to Mr. Paterson, saying he was marvellous and he would look after me. So I had all the recommendations that he was the right person to see. I went to see him privately at Spire Parkway Hospital. He seemed a very charming man. He was very sympathetic, very caring, or so it seemed at the time. He examined me. I had the mammograms and everything else, the fine needle aspirations, and he said yes, there was obviously a lump there and it needed to be removed. So I went ahead, had the surgery. 2 years later then I found another lump in the same breast, went back to see him. He said this seemed very sinister and needed operating on straight away, so that operation took place as well. It was only later when he came to court and the trial began in 2017 that I contacted Spire Parkway to ask if they'd recalled me, because I had moved away from the area during the time he was being investigated.
They had recalled me back to the hospital, so I went. I think it was January 2017. I saw another breast surgeon then who examined me, did the mammograms, everything else, looked at all my notes, went back to see him again about a week later. He'd gone through my notes and all I had was cysts in my breasts. I didn't need the operations that I was told were fibroadenomas and needed looking at and investigating.
And sorry to interrupt you, Judith, but
yes.
What had Ian Paterson said to you about the nature of the lumps when you were operated on?
It said, oh yes, this could be cancerous, it needs removing. When I had the second lump, as I say, he said it was a very sinister, different type of lump, and he had to look into it. And that really gave me a lot of worry. I had 2 early teenage children. They were 13 and 15, I think, at the time. My mother was ill, and it was just a very hard time for me because I didn't want to have cancer at that time in my life.
I'm sure everybody could understand that. So when you found out 17 years later, 17 years after you first saw Ian Paterson, that you didn't need to have these operations, what went through your mind?
I felt angry to start with. I've had quite a lot of illnesses in my life, and I just felt these were 2 operations I didn't need. I didn't need all the worry, all the upset of perhaps having to tell my children I was ill. I felt a bit sad as well, really. I felt sad for all the other ladies this had happened to, and I really couldn't believe what had gone on. And it took me back again, you know, to the time when I was operated on.
Because you were effectively misled into having operations that you didn't need.
Yes, yes, that's the top and bottom of it. Yes, I was. I thought, oh, this is cancer. This is a big C. I've got to get rid of it, and hopefully I'll be all right. And at that time, then I thought Mr. Paterson was wonderful because I went back to the consultations after the operations, and he told me I was okay. He did actually keep seeing me every 6 months under the private scheme, just to check everything was all right. But I didn't have any further operations, thank goodness.
What are your feelings towards this person who, at best, misdiagnosed you?
Well, I really feel he's a very evil person to have done this, not just to me but to everybody. It was probably for greed. He was probably greedy and wanted all the money as well. But I'm sure he had a good lifestyle anyway. I don't see he needed the extra money coming in when he was getting it under such awful circumstances. And it's unbelievable, really, that someone can do this. I do think it is just a very evil thing to do.
The inquiry findings today are also very critical of the system that enabled Ian Paterson to carry out these unnecessary operations. And what do you think of the report today?
Yes, I haven't read all the report yet. I've seen the main items that were on it. And it looks like there's still quite a way to go before everything is more secure in the system. I think the idea of having perhaps team meetings before you do the operations and everybody being involved, because I'm sure some people who were working with him, or perhaps not with him all the time, must have been a little bit suspicious that some of these things didn't need to happen.
OK, we have to leave it there. Judith Eva, a former patient of Ian Paterson, thank you so much for talking to us and sharing your story there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.